Hey guys, it's Lockie here. I just wanted to let you in on a recent light painting tutorial that we did on Photography Camp. I think there's some valuable information in here that you'll really enjoy. It's all about slow shutter photography, how we mix in some flash with light painting using glow sticks or torches, and I hope you get as much out of this as the students on the camp did. Slow shutter photography. All right. Now that I know you guys are all excited. So slow shutter photography is when you slow the shutter speed down to try and capture something that you obviously couldn't do at a higher shutter speed. So I'm going to go through a few examples here so you can get an idea of just what is possible. And I guess the key ingredient is you need darkness, because if you don't do it in darkness, you're going to pick up on things in the image that you don't want. So you start with a pitch black, nighttime being the obvious way to do it, or inside a studio that's pitch black, and you add light. So just like you do in any other photo you take, things are lit by sources of light, whether it's the sun, whether it's a torch, whether it's a flashlight off the camera. You're adding light to the scene to expose an image that looks like possibly something like this. Left hand side, what's that?
Sparkles.
Fire spinning around. Right hand side, how would that be done? Tracing with like glow sticks around two people who would stand there for reference, and someone behind running around tracing the outline and just creating that effect. So another one, that's a 30-second exposure, and even on a dark, like kind of pitch black night, I remember that night looked pitch black. So what you're seeing in the background with the oranges in the sky, over 30 seconds, that's actually what comes up. Whether we had any light drawing going on or not, that's the sky. Just over 30 seconds it exposes like that. Okay, so no matter what, ambient light sources like that would have been from the moon and some like city lights in the background, slowly creep in, and over a 30-second exposure it just becomes more and more light that adds to the scene. So an important thing to remember is that when you're doing your light painting, if someone turns on their head torch while you're creating, even if they're facing it kind of away, it spills light. Even the smallest amount of light will spill into the scene and may wreck what you're trying to do. So it's about just adding the bits of light that you want into the scene. The right one is someone fire twirling and just constantly walking across one diagonal, and someone with a glow stick like staff spinning and going in the other direction and just intersecting through the middle. And that's probably a 10 to 15 second exposure. The left isn't necessarily light painting. I just thought I'd give you an example of where that was a situation. I was working in my office one night, looked outside, and the dude had pulled up on the side of the road, and it was like walking around his car a bit. I didn't know what he was doing. I like, my window looked out, and all of a sudden I see the front of his car go orange, and he was at the back of his car just doing something with gear, and I come out and I go, "Hey, your car's on fire." He's like, "What?" "It is." And turns out his car had overheated, which is why he had stopped. And the reason it had overheated is because it was very hot and burst into flames, and I went out and took a photo. And and that's a firefighter there, but that came after a little while. Yeah. And you obviously need a slow shutter to try and capture that. That was handheld, which is where like a good lens that has vibration reduction helps to capture a more steady shot. Like, I didn't come out and set up the full tripod and lights or anything, but still needs a level of slow shutter to capture that sort of thing. I actually went inside and printed him a photo of his car and brought it back out to take home.
This is what happened.
Yeah, it was his wife's car. You'll see this is kind of at dusk where there's still light in the sky. Not much, but it's over 5 seconds or so it's come up, and you'll notice that you can see the person, which is me, doing the fire twirling. So because the light from the sky has spilled across and I've stood still in that photo, you can see me. Whereas generally, if you're moving around or if it's dark enough, and you're wearing even, dark clothes, you shouldn't be able to, you're trying to hide in the darkness, basically. Okay, if you stay still, there's more chance of ambient light soaking in and you being seen, but if you're moving constantly, it's less likely you'll be seen. That's a shot at a race where we've used some flash on the camera to pop on the rider and freeze them. So we're adding that light by capturing the rider by adding a strobe light on the camera. It goes pop for, a fraction of a second and exposes her very, very brightly. So that's why she's bright. And she rides off, obviously, and her headlights go, and then the shutter stays open and just soaks in the stars. And all that darkness slowly becomes brighter in the sky and the clouds and the stars. So it's a mixture between freezing the action of a rider and the background in the sky kind of being exposed over 15, 20 seconds. And the one thing that wrecked that night was when riders came through close together, because you'd take that photo and all of a sudden you'd get more lights coming in the background that would completely wreck that whole trail and blow it out, and then kind of wrecked the exposure, unfortunately. But that one was...
How much editing would have gone into that?
Probably a lot of shadows pushed and highlights, like whites, pumped up so that you can see the stars more. I don't have the original to show you, but like our standard settings, like you try and get it right in camera, and then you just tweak it to obviously, to fix contrast and shadows if you want to see more in the trees, and to make stars stand out a bit more. Sometimes you can use in Lightroom what's called a graduated filter. So if the sky wasn't quite as bright as you wanted, but everything else was good, you can actually use like a gradient that comes across, and you set, say, the exposure to pump it up a little bit, and that will create like the sky downwards kind of just is brighter and fades off. So there's little things like that you can do, but yeah, you try and get it as good as you can in camera, which is why it's a mixture of different lighting, things like flashes and stuff, all comes together in one hopefully okay shot in camera. Yeah. One thing that can happen when you're taking these sorts of photos is that if you have, say, an action like that rider that we just saw, or in this shot, Mike and I have had the flash pop, but then we've gone out of the scene, we've walked away. And can you see what's happened? Can you see through Mike there? And me a little bit?
Yeah.
Especially our black shirts. So because we haven't stayed there, like if say that was a 1 second photo and the flash popped and most of that exposure is us in the frame being nice and bright, then it will stay, we'd be fairly solid. But because we've then walked out and left it to keep soaking in with the ambient light with a slow shutter, it actually creates that ghosting effect where the light behind starts seeping into
us and overpowering what the flash managed to capture.
Yeah. Does that make sense?
Edges and the logo and stuff.
Yeah. Cool. That's kind of pulling all our skills together, using flashes to make that rider stand out again. And multiple flashes as well, coming from different angles to light that nicely, and then you leave the shutter run for another 30 seconds to get the stars in the sky.
And
looks pretty good on there.
Yeah, and you can see in the background, just at the ramp just here, you can see how close we came to having this shot sort of stuffed up a bit like what Lockie was talking about, because that light there is another rider just behind this guy coming into frame, but there was just enough space between them that it didn't overlap.
So let's talk about settings that you would use. You need a tripod because I think we all know by now that you'll get motion blur if you don't keep it steady. Okay, so over 5 seconds or so, if you don't have a tripod and you're trying to hand hold it, you literally can't hold it and get it perfect. So you need a tripod or the ground or a crate or anything, a table that's going to be sturdy. Yeah. You'll want to use full manual mode, including ISO. You'll want to set it. Basically, at nighttime, your camera doesn't know how to read the light, what's going on. You have to tell it what to do, okay? And the main thing being that you start with your shutter speed, setting it to how long you need to to do whatever it is you're trying to do, whether it's writing your name, whether it's getting someone twirling things around. You set it based on how long you need, and then you kind of tweak the settings around that. Manual focus as well. At nighttime, your camera has a very hard time in pitch black of focusing. One thing you can do is, if you have the chance to pre-focus by, say you have someone who's going to write their name, you shine a torch on them before you take the shot, get your focus set, and then flick it to manual. They turn their torch off and then do the light painting. You're talking about like a torch to light them up just to get the focus. Does that make sense? And then you turn it to manual focus so that when you press the shutter button, it doesn't try and focus in the pitch black. Nod your head if that makes sense.
And we'll demonstrate it later.
Yep. Low ISO will help, because if you have a high ISO, especially when you're shooting dark scenes, high ISO, especially if you have to bump it up brighter later in post, will show a lot of digital noise, that grain. So the lower ISO you start with, the better the outcome will be of the photo. But sometimes, depending on the light source you're using, you might need the sensor to be a bit more sensitive to soak it in quicker. So that's something you can play with, but you'd start with down as low as 100 or 200 and experiment between that and 1000 ISO, somewhere between there. Aperture is basically used, you'll set that depending on how much you want in focus. I'd recommend using a wide-ish lens, because whatever you're doing, you'll probably end up wanting to have a relatively wide field of view and do your thing just in front of the camera rather than have to run 20 meters away to do it with a zoom lens on. So use a wide lens, and with a wide lens, generally more will be in focus. So a smaller aperture number, as in wide open aperture, will help you, but you just set it, if you need more in focus, you would just set a high number, f5.6, f7, f9, but obviously less light comes in to the camera, so there's trade-offs to doing that. All right, shutter speed, like I said, just depends on what you're doing. Okay, but if it takes you 5 seconds to write your name, and during that 5 seconds, that's not enough time for the light, ambient light, or the stars to show, then you would do a 10-second or 15-second exposure, use the 5 seconds to write your name, and then let it keep going. You walk out of the scene and let it keep going to soak in those extra details that you want, which should work quite well.
Yeah, and remember as well that, on top of controlling the shutter speed as well, if you're using a glow stick or a torch, how quickly you move the light source will also impact. So if you move it really quickly, you'll probably get a very faint line. Whereas if you hold it in place and you kind of just let it take its time as it runs through the image.
It's kind of like a whiteboard marker, if you write too quickly, whereas if you write a bit slower, it sinks the ink in.
Yeah, effectively allows it to seep in. The slower that you run it, the light source, the more time it has to seep in and really, brighten up. So that's another way of adjusting the ratio of your light painting to the ambient.
Cool. So in this case, twirling a glow stick around, doing it multiple times will make it soak in better than just doing it once or twice. That's Mount Barney, where we were going to be going. This is a mixture of popping a flash and letting it run for a long period of time, and I stayed dead still in that bathtub for 30 seconds or something, just so that I didn't become ghosted like that shot of Mike and I. So sometimes if you want a person in the shot, you can do that and have them stay dead still. All right, we're going to do a bit of an activity. Are there any questions before we have a bit of a play? Any questions? Yep.
Where would you shine the light? Like, if you're trying to do one of those shots, do you have to make sure the light shining into the lens, or
it's possible that if you shine your light in the lens that you get some weird lens flares, but the chances and the amount of times I've done it that it's really impacted, you might get 1 in a million, 1 in 100 that really affects it. So you just point your torch towards your camera general direction, and you're not likely to stuff up your photo. Yeah.
as long as you can see it, as long as it's not obstructed, you'll be fine.
Yeah, and a good tip if you're writing your name or something, is to have a torch where you cover it up when you want to move it and it not be seen, and then obviously do this to write, move it to the next
Yeah.
letter, and it becomes a bit of an art. And do you write your name like backwards at the camera, or do you write your name like this, where your torch is shining towards the camera and you're doing it the normal way you write, because it's neater. So there's little tricks to doing it. Cool. All right. Any other questions? Any confusion? No.